The wrong bride's trunk hit the hotel counter, so hard every man in Bitter Creek turned to watch her humiliation. Harlan Vale smiled at Nora Bell as if she were damaged freight. "I paid for a St. Louis bride," he said, "not this." The eastbound would not return for 7 days. Nora had no room, no family in town, and no coin left except the fare Harlan refused to return. By sunset, he meant to have her either in his kitchen or in his debt. Caleb Mercer had come to town for nails, lamp oil, and the last talk he meant to have with the lumber team before spring work began at his ranch. But before the room took another breath, he knew he was looking at a woman being trapped in public. The woman standing at the counter was not the sort who cried because a room had gone quiet around her. She was travel-worn, dust on the hem of her brown dress, dark hair pinned back under a plain hat, one gloved hand still resting on the trunk lid as if she meant to hold her ground by force alone. She looked close to 30, old enough to have chosen this journey with both eyes open, and proud enough that the silence around her hurt more than the words being spoken. Her back went straighter. "My name is Nora Bell," she said. "I answered your notice, I brought your letters, I sold what I owned to come here." "Then you sold it on the wrong guess." Harlan shoved the trunk toward her again. "I don't marry mistakes." No one laughed. That silence was not mercy. It was permission. Every man in the room understood what Harlan was doing, and every one of them let him do it. Marta Henshaw, who helped her brother run the station kitchen, stood in the doorway with a flour sack in her arms and looked at the floor instead of the woman. Two freight hands at the stove kept their eyes on their cups. The station clerk turned a page that did not need turning. Nora Bell took one breath that seemed to cost her something. "Then return my fare." Harlan gave a short, ugly little chuckle. "Your fare? Lady, that money brought you here. If you expect board until the eastbound comes through next week, you can work your debt in my kitchen and thank me for the chance. My sister's got laundry enough to keep you useful." Something in the room changed. Caleb felt it the way he felt a storm before the first hit of rain. Nora did not step back. "I am not your debt," she said. Harlan's smile thinned. "You are if you slept under my roof tonight." That was the moment Caleb started walking. He did not move quickly. Men moved quickly when they wanted a scene. He had no use for scenes. He came to the counter in his worn dark coat, the brim of his hat shadowing the burn scar that dragged from his left cheek down along his jaw. He set a small sack of nails beside Nora's trunk as if he were merely adding another piece of freight to the counter. "She doesn't owe you a year for a train seat," he said. Harlan's eyes narrowed. "This is hotel business." "Not if you're calling a woman freight." Caleb looked at Nora then fully because she deserved that much. "Name." "Nora Bell." "I'm Caleb Mercer. My place is 6 miles above the spur. Burned house, standing barn, 2 bunkrooms, enough work to keep spring honest. 30 days' wages if you want them. Marta can hear the terms. You keep your own fair money. You sleep behind a bolted door, and if any man says you belong to him, he says it in front of me. If you want the eastbound after that, I hitch the team myself." Harlan barked a laugh, but there was strain in it now. "You'll take a stranger to your place because I don't like the package she arrived in." Caleb did not turn toward him. "I'll take a woman who was promised a name and handed a kitchen debt instead." Nora searched his face as if she expected to find mockery tucked in the scar tissue. She did not. She found something that looked harder than kindness and steadier than pity. "What work?" she asked. "Cooking some, mending some, mostly helping me make a house stand where a fire left a ruin." Harlan put both palms on the counter. "She's under my roof if she stays in town. That's my board." Caleb reached into his coat and laid silver on the wood. "Then she won't stay under your roof." Marta finally raised her head. "I'll witness the bargain," she said softly. Harlan shot her a look sharp enough to cut rope, but she did not take the words back. Nora glanced at the silver, then at the room full of men who had watched Harlan try to turn her into labor and said nothing at all. Pride fought with caution across her face. Caution lost by a hair. 30 days, she said. 30 days, Caleb answered. He lifted one end of the trunk. She took the other without asking him to spare her. That was the second thing he noticed about her after the pride. The road up from Bitter Creek climbed in switchbacks through black grass and scrub pine that had only just begun to green back after last year's fire. Caleb drove with Nora beside him on the freight seat, her trunk wedged behind them, the silence between them easier than the silence inside the hotel had been. When they topped the last rise, the burned shell of his house stood against the late light like a jaw with half its teeth broken out. Nora stared. Caleb did not blame her. The front wall still stood, and one side of the roof line, but the porch had burned away and the big room inside remained open to the sky. The bunkhouse and barn had been saved because Caleb and 3 ranch hands had cut the fire line there in time. He had not managed the same for the house. His older brother, Ben, had died trying to drive the last mares clear of the lower corral. Caleb had dragged 2 horses and 1 stable boy out of the heat and earned the scar on his face for the trouble. The house was what remained when memory refused to burn all the way through. "You said burned house," Nora said at last. "I try not to oversell things." To his surprise, the corner of her mouth moved, almost a smile. "No one could accuse you of that." He stopped the wagon between the bunkhouse and the black shell of the main house. The barn stood broad and weathered to one side. Beyond it, the ridge dropped into a meadow where late snowmelt still silvered the grass. "Bunkroom's clean," he said. "Marta rides up tomorrow with linens. You eat from the ranch stores and you earn wages from day one. If you choose to leave after 30 days, you leave with the silver and no speech from me. And if I choose to leave sooner, then sooner." That answer seemed to steady her more than anything else he could have said. She climbed down from the wagon and turned slowly, taking in the place. Her gaze caught on the blackened doorway of the ruined house, then shifted to the bunkhouse, then to Caleb himself. "Do you live in there?" she asked, nodding toward the house. "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because walls are faster to build than the nerve to sleep behind them." That earned him a direct look, not sympathy, not fear, only understanding so quick and bare it made him wish, for one absurd second, that he had met her before fire and freight and scars had made both of them so careful. He carried the trunk to the bunkhouse room. It was plain: narrow bed, washstand, braided rug, 1 small shelf, 1 bolt on the inside of the door. When he stepped back to let her enter first, she noticed. "You keep standing aside as if I'm liable to bolt." "I keep standing aside because you're not mine to place." Her eyes held his a moment longer than they had to. "That is better." He left her there with the small oil lamp lit, then crossed to the shed linta where he kept his own cot and saddle blanket. He could feel her presence on the ridge the way a man feels a lantern lit in a room he had long ago stopped entering. Supper happened in the little kitchen room off the bunkhouse, because Nora said plainly that if she was taking wages she would start that evening, and Caleb had long since learned not to argue with people trying to keep their pride intact. The stores were thin after winter. Salt pork, beans, flour, onions soft at the neck, coffee, and 1 jar of peaches Caleb had been saving without quite knowing why. Nora moved through the room with a weariness she never mentioned, tying up her sleeves and checking every shelf as if inventory itself were a language she trusted better than comfort. "You can sit," she said when she found him still standing near the door. "I can mend harness while supper happens." "Then mend harness." He sat at the table with the bridle leather in his hands and watched her without making a show of it. She worked quickly, but not nervously. Nothing in her motion begged to be thanked. She cut the salt pork lean, soaked the beans, and scraped the soft rot from the onions rather than wasting the whole vegetable. When the skillet started to speak in the firelight, the room changed. "You know how to salvage a mean pantry," he said. "I know how not to starve while waiting for luck to improve." The answer landed harder than her quiet tone suggested. He ate the meal she set before him in the scorched blue enamel plate that had survived the fire because Ben had dropped it in the yard the week before. Nora noticed the plate's blackened edge. "How's fire?" "Yes." "And you kept the plate?" "It was still useful." She looked up from her own plate then, a little too fast, as if usefulness was a thing she knew too much about. "Useful things get kept," she said. Caleb laid down his fork. Not every kept thing is only useful. For the first time since he had seen her at the hotel window, Nora Bell looked uncertain. He did not press. He had no wish to turn the room small around her. When the meal was over, she washed the dishes while he carried water. He did not try the doorway again when she closed the bunkhouse room behind her for the night. He slept on his cot under the lean-to, staring across the dark at the burned house frame and thinking about the sound of a woman's steps on his ridge. Morning brought town with it. The ranch hands were due by noon to start lifting the first porch supports, and Caleb needed more nails and a length of chain from the spur, so he and Nora rode back down together in the wagon. The talk in Bitter Creek began before the horses stopped. "Wrong bride." "Poor fool." "Mercer took her." Caleb heard all of it and answered none of it. He helped Nora down and walked with her to the store where he intended to pay her first week's wages in front of anyone still inclined to think she belonged to Harlan Vale's kitchen. Nora understood his purpose the instant he set the coins in her palm. "You did not have to do that here," she murmured. "Yes," he said, "I did." The storekeeper pretended to rearrange sacks while every eye in the place counted the silver. Nora closed her fingers over it, spine straight as a fence post. "Thank you," she said, not soft, not embarrassed, as if accepting honest money in public were its own declaration of war. Harlan chose that moment to enter. He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe and smiled at the room. "Caleb paying by the week now. Careful, Mercer. She may cost you more than a better bride would have." Caleb turned before Nora could answer. "You already said what sort of bride you wanted." Harlan's smile curdled. "And you said what sort of fool you are, charity bride then." The storekeeper's hand froze over the flour sacks. One woman near the ribbon shelf looked away, ashamed too late. Nora surprised them both. "No," she said, lifting her chin toward Harlan. "He said what sort of man he is. The room heard you say what sort you are." The store went still, in a different way this time. Harlan laughed, but there was a brittle edge on it. Careful with that tongue. A woman alone in Bitter Creek should guard what little welcome she can manage. "Then I am fortunate not to be relying on yours." Caleb saw Harlan weigh the room and let the moment pass. That told him something. Harlan wanted control more than noise. Men like that were worst when smiling. They left the store with the chain and the nails. Halfway to the wagon, Marta Henshaw called softly after Nora. "Miss Bell." Nora stopped. Caleb kept walking, then stopped too when he saw the urgency in Marta's face. "My brother's out back with the drayman," Marta said. "If you want the truth of what happened before you, come to the cellar after dusk. Come alone." Nora's fingers tightened around the money purse hidden in her skirt. "Why would you tell me anything now?" Marta's gaze flickered toward the hotel. "Because I should have spoken yesterday." That evening, Caleb found Nora standing at the corral gate with her shawl over her shoulders. "I need to go down to town," she said. "At dusk." Marta Henshaw sent word. His jaw tightened before he meant it too. "You trust her?" "No." "Good." She almost smiled. I wasn't asking permission. Good again. He took his hat from the peg by the door. You can ride with me to the edge of town. After that, you decide how much danger you're willing to meet without company. Marta led Nora through the hotel kitchen once the supper crowd had thinned. Caleb waited outside in the dark beside the hitch rail, where the lamplight from the windows cut yellow bars across the dirt. He could hear no more than clatter and low voices, but he stayed where he had promised to stay, because standing too close to a choice could make it feel stolen. Below the kitchen, the cellar smelled of onions, damp wood, and old soap. Marta lifted a lantern and showed Nora 3 trunks lined against the far wall. Whose are those? Nora asked. Women who left with nothing or stayed because they thought they had no choice. Marta swallowed. One from Cheyenne, one from St. Joseph, one from Omaha like you. I am from Omaha. I boarded in Omaha. I started in Council Bluffs. Then one from Council Bluffs. Marta winced as if the correction shamed her too. Harlan runs notices where he can. Sometimes he wants the woman. Sometimes he wants the fee. Sometimes he only wants hands he can say owe him board. Cora keeps them washing linen and turning mattresses until they can no longer afford to leave. Nora stared at the trunks, then at the shelf above them where several folded paper tickets lay under a crock. Return tickets. Marta nodded. Why show me this? Because yesterday you looked at that counter the way my mother looked at a gate once, when she knew no one meant to open it for her. Nora went very still, and you still said nothing. Marta did not defend herself, no. That was better than excuse. It was not enough. How many? Nora asked. Counting you, 4 in 2 years that I know of. There may have been more notices farther down the line. Nora touched the nearest trunk, not gently. Do they know? Not all of it. The ones who stayed hear the debt story often enough that it starts to sound like law. Nora let her hand fall. It is not law. No. Then why not take the tickets and hand them over? Marta's face tightened. Because the hotel stands in Harlan's name, the kitchen stands in mine, and fear is a poor thing but a stubborn one. If Harlan knows I showed you this, he will not wait for next week's train. He will make you an example before breakfast. When Nora came back up the cellar stairs, there was something different in the way she held her shoulders. Anger had found a purpose. Caleb read it before she reached the hitch rail. Bad? He asked. Worse than bad. He drove them back to the ridge under a moon thin as wire. Nora told him everything once they had put enough road between themselves and the hotel lamps. He listened without interrupting. That was one of the gifts the fire had left him, the habit of letting a person speak all the way through pain before laying his own words over it. If what Marta says is true, he said when she finished, we can go to the stage company. And tell them what? That the man they contract for rooms and freight turns stranded women into laundry hands. That should be enough. Should be is a weak kind of hope. He could not disagree. Back at the ranch, the black frame of the house waited where it always did. Caleb went to it without quite thinking, set his hand on the charred post that marked the old front corner, and stared into the empty rectangle where the doorway would be once more. Nora came to stand beside him. You still mean to rebuild all of it? Yes. Even though you won't sleep there. One problem at a time. She looked through the doorway frame into the dark room beyond, then at him. Would your brother have wanted it rebuilt? Caleb had not heard Ben's name spoken on that ridge in months. He would have wanted the house alive again, he said. Whether for me or for somebody after me, I don't know. Maybe houses don't care which. Nora reached up and rested her fingers on the rough edge of the blackened wood. Maybe they only care whether someone walks through them by choice. He turned toward her then, and the moon caught the scar he usually kept hidden under shadow. Most women looked away too quickly or looked too long. Nora did neither. "You're staring," he said. "So are you. I started first. Then you can stop first." He did not stop. Neither did she. The moment broke only when the wind shifted and lifted loose ash from the old sill. Caleb stepped back, suddenly aware of how close they had drifted to something neither of them yet knew how to name. The next week passed in labor that felt more intimate than talking would have. Nora mended shirts, counted stores, and somehow made 3 thin meals a day without once looking defeated by the pantry. Caleb fixed rails, set porch supports, and carried ridge pine from the wagon track to the house frame. They worked side by side often enough that he learned the shape of her silences. The one that meant anger, the one that meant she was thinking, the one that meant she had felt some old hurt brush past and chosen not to show it. He also learned what startled her into laughter: chickens, bent nails, the ranch hand Eli Boone trying to court the widow at the post office with a hat too small for his head. Once, when Caleb split his knuckles driving a stubborn hinge pin, Nora took his hand without warning and wrapped the cut with a strip torn from one of the ruined chemise sleeves left in her trunk. "You tear your own things for my bad hands?" he asked. "I tear ruined cloth for a useful purpose." But the color in her face told him usefulness was not the only reason. By the time the first clean pine doorframe stood against the blackened wall, he had started looking for her before he knew he was doing it. At dawn by the water barrel, at noon near the kitchen fire, at dusk wherever the ridge wind lifted her hair loose from its pins. That was when Harlan made his next move. The freight boy came up the trail blowing hard and dust white, holding a folded note pinched between 2 fingers like it carried stink. Caleb read it once and felt his chest tighten. The ridge pine he had paid for in winter would not be delivered. Harlan had told the Teamsters there was a dispute over final freight charges and no load would leave the yard until Caleb settled in person. Beneath that, in smaller writing, came the real message: "Bring back the woman, and I might remember our old price." Nora read it over his shoulder. "He thinks I'm worth lumber now," she said. Caleb crushed the note in his fist. "He thinks he can turn everything into an exchange." "Can he?" "Not if I sell spring horses early." She turned sharply toward him. "No. It's my herd. And your rebuild, and your whole season. He set the price that way because he thinks I'll tell you to pay it." "Would you?" "No," her eyes flashed. "I'd sooner sleep in the freight yard." He looked at her for a long moment. "There's a Saturday eastbound. I can buy you a clean ticket and put you on it before he dirties your name any farther." The words were honest. That was the trouble with them. Nora went still in a way he had come to fear. "So that's what this is," she said. "It's the surest path clear of him. And clear of me too." "Nora." "No." She stepped back from him, and hurt sharpened her voice more cleanly than anger had. "I know pity when I hear it dressed as reason. You brought me here because Harlan shamed you. Now he has made me expensive, and you would like to set me back on a train before I cost more." "That isn't what I said." "It's what you offered." She turned and walked toward the bunkhouse before he could gather the right words fast enough to stop her. He stood with the note in one hand and understood, too late, that a man who had lived too long with loss sometimes mistook surrender for mercy. Night made no room for sleep on either side of the ranch. At dawn, Nora found the trunk in her room, slashed open in half its contents on the floor. Her plain church dress had been cut through the bodice. The cloth purse where she kept needles and thread lay under the chair. The train ticket Caleb had bought and set quietly on her table the night before had been torn in two. Only the small, fair envelope stayed safe, because she had hidden it inside her sewing roll before sleeping. Caleb was at the doorway, a heartbeat after she cried out. He took in the room, the ruined dress, the torn ticket, and then her face. Who was here? No one I saw. He crouched by the window, touched the sill, and found a smear of hotel soap and one broken thread of red hotel blanket wool caught on the splinter. The anger that rose in him then was cold, not hot. Harlan sent someone. Nora held up the torn ticket. He wanted an answer. He'll get one. The freight boy's younger sister, a sharp little thing named Elsie who helped at the wash line in town, arrived before noon with the rest of the truth. She had seen Cora's cousin Tom Pike riding up from the ranch road before dawn. She had heard him brag in the feed shed that no woman stayed free after crossing Harlan Vale. Nora stood in the yard with the torn ticket in her hand and looked from Caleb to the black doorway frame to the long road back to Bitter Creek. He thinks fear will make me cheap, she said. Then leave this to me, Caleb said. She turned on him so fast he almost stepped back. No, if you leave this to men, another man will decide what I am worth. That is the whole sickness. He did step back then, not from fear of her, but from respect for the force inside her. What do you want to do? Stay. The word hit him harder than any plea could have. Stay for the barn raising, she said. Stay until he says what he says to women when he thinks no witness matters. Stay until those other trunks leave that cellar with their owners. Then I'll decide where I go. That was the moment she stopped being a guest on his ridge and became something far more dangerous to his peace. Then we hold the lumber here long enough to force him to speak, Caleb said. Can we? If I risk enough. What enough? He looked toward the south meadow, where his best spring colts moved like dark water through the grass. The sale note on the Mercer herd. Nora's expression changed. You would risk that for me. For you, he said, and because Truth had already made a wreck of caution that morning, he added, and for the house, and because I am tired of men like him deciding what women owe for being stranded. Her breath caught, not because he had said too much, because he had finally said enough. She tied her shawl tighter and walked with him to the corral, where the ranch hands were saddling up for the day. Then let's make sure he speaks where the whole yard can hear him. They did not go straight back to work after that. Nora followed Caleb to the half-framed porch while the morning wind moved through the bare studs of the house. Eli and Lewis had ridden to the lower pasture to turn the remuda, which left the yard oddly still. On that ridge, with the torn ticket behind them and the showdown ahead, stillness no longer felt gentle. Caleb knelt beside the threshold and lifted a plane to the rough edge of the new pine sill. If you're staying for the fight, he said, I want one more truth paid forward. Nora sat on the porch beam opposite him, shawl tucked around her elbows. That sounds expensive. Usually is. He shaved another curl of wood free and did not look up at once. Ben built this house too fast when he married, wanted every board standing before the priest rode out. My brother thought haste proved devotion. My sister-in-law said the walls never learned their voices because he gave them no time. After the fire, I told myself I wasn't rebuilding because the place still felt like a grave. That was only half true. A whole house asks who you mean to keep warm inside it. I had no answer worth hearing. She rested her hands on the beam between them. And now? He finally met her eyes. Now I mind the question. The softness that crossed her face did not weaken her. It only made her look more tired of carrying herself alone. I came west because I was tired of rooms where every kindness ended in a count, she said. Board, stitching, errands, smiles. Even church women in Omaha could turn charity into a leash if they pulled slowly enough. When I answered Harlan's letters, I told myself marriage would be cleaner than that. One promise, one home, one clear place. She looked toward the doorway frame. Then I reached Bitter Creek and learned a wrong promise can look exactly like an old leash. Behind them, Bitter Creek looked quiet. Nora no longer trusted quiet. Quiet was how men like Harlan counted witnesses before they struck. Caleb set the plane down. What would a clean place look like to you? Nora seemed surprised by the question, as if men usually skipped past it and offered the place before asking what shape it ought to have. A table where I don't have to earn the chair every day, she said after a moment. A room that stays mine if I speak plainly. Work that gets paid because it is work, not because it buys me the right to be tolerated. Her gaze returned to him, and a man who asks instead of deciding. Then if we win tomorrow, the first shelf in this house goes where you say. The smile that came then was small, but it carried warmth enough to make the black frame behind him seem less like ruin and more like waiting lumber. That is not the finest courtship line a woman has ever heard, she said. I never claimed polish. No, only decency. So far it wears better. Tomorrow Harlan would try to name her again. Tonight, Caleb wanted to know what name she would choose for herself. She reached down before leaving and touched the unscarred side of his jaw with the backs of her fingers. So lightly, he might have mistaken it for wind if her eyes had not held his while she did it. Then she walked toward the bunkhouse to begin mixing bread for the men, and Caleb stayed on the porch with his hand braced against the new sill, wondering when the ridge had stopped feeling empty and started feeling unfinished without her in it. That afternoon and the next morning turned the ranch into a place waiting for impact. Eli Boone and Louis Ortega hauled beams into stacks near the house frame. Caleb rode the lower line to warn the teamsters that payment would be made at the yard, not the hotel. Nora cooked for 8 men at noon and 10 by dusk, and somehow still found the strength to go over every crate, sack, and tool pile so nothing Harlan controlled would take them by surprise. Marta Henshaw came up the ridge near evening with 2 women Nora had not met before. May Collins from Cheyenne and Ruthie Sloan from St. Joseph, both older than Nora by only a few years, and both wearing the cautious look of people long trained to thank small mercies. Marta stopped well short of the porch. I came because silence has turned rotten in me, she said. Nora did not move to spare her. Say what you need to say. I knew Harlan kept the tickets. I knew Cora shaved the board bills so the women never cleared the debt. I told myself it was not the same as chaining a person because the door stood open, but a road with no money and no bed at the end of it is only another kind of chain. May Collins looked at the ground. I scrubbed their linen for 6 months before I saw $1. Ruthie Sloan lifted her chin. I stayed because my brother was eastbound, and Harlan told me letters cost board too. Caleb watched Nora take that in, watched the fury inside her settle into something colder and better built. Will you both stand in the yard tomorrow if he denies it? She asked. May answered first, if you stand first. I will. Marta's eyes shone, but Nora did not offer comfort yet. And you? She asked Marta. I will speak. Then be ready to lose your place. Marta gave one rough nod. I should have lost it sooner. After they left, the ridge went quiet except for the hammering from the porch rail Caleb and Eli were setting against the dark. Nora stood at the washstand with her sleeves rolled, mending the ripped dress she no longer needed for church so much as for proof that some things could be repaired without becoming what they had been before. Caleb came to the doorway and leaned one shoulder there. If you decide in the morning that this is too much, I hitch the wagon and take you anywhere you name. She kept stitching for another 2 breaths before answering. Would you hate me for leaving? No. Would you be relieved? That was the harder question. No, he said at last. She looked up. Then what would you be? He came 1 step into the room, not farther. A man who let fear speak before honesty. The needle stilled in her hand. And what is honesty saying now? He had spent months rebuilding walls. This felt like stepping into fire with no bucket in sight. That I wanted you safe before I let myself want you near." The room went very still. Nora set the dress down carefully, as if sudden movement might break something invisible and rare between them. "That is better than pity," she said. "It is. And if tomorrow goes badly, then I still meant it." He turned to go because staying 1 second longer might have made him forget every careful thing he had promised himself. Her voice stopped him at the threshold. "Caleb." He looked back. "Do not let Harlan speak over me tomorrow." It was not a request for rescue, it was a request for space. "I won't," he said. Barn-raising day dawned clean and bright, the kind of Montana spring morning that made a man believe hard work might be rewarded if he only swung the hammer long enough. The house frame stood waiting against the sky, black old timbers cut through with fresh pale pine. Caleb had not seen it look so close to alive since before the fire. By 8 o'clock the yard held ranch hands, 2 teamsters with the pine load, Marta and the other women standing near the bunkhouse, and half the kind of onlookers a small district always produced when trouble smelled likely. Nora moved among them with a coffee pot in one hand and a stillness in her shoulders that Caleb trusted more than most men's shouting. She wore the mendied brown dress, a blue work apron over it, and no ribbon from any bridal trunk. She had chosen exactly how she meant to be seen. Harlan Vale arrived late on purpose. He came in a clean coat, Cora beside him in a hat too fine for the dirt of a work yard, Tom Pike behind them with the wagon whip coiled in his fist. Harlan smiled at the assembled crew as if he had been invited to a church supper. "Mercer," he called, "before your men set one board from that load, we settle our dispute." Caleb came down from the ladder and wiped his hands on his jeans. "No dispute. I paid in February. Paid for freight under ordinary good faith. You interfered in my hotel business and enticed a contracted woman away from work owed." A ripple moved through the yard. Nora set the coffee pot down. "Contracted," she said. Harlan did not look at her. He addressed the men as if she were still an item in the story rather than the person the story was about. "Every man here knows rail and board cost money. A woman brought west under promise and housed at my station owes value if she breaks terms." "What terms?" Nora asked. He still did not face her. Caleb saw her understand the insult in that and decide, in one breath, how to use it. She walked straight toward Harlan's wagon, reached up, and pulled the chalk board from beneath the driver's seat where Cora used it to tally board bills. Gasps followed the motion, not because the board mattered much by itself, but because no one in Bitter Creek had expected Nora Bell to lay hands on Harlan Vale's property in full daylight. "These terms," she asked, turning the board toward the crew. "The ones your sister writes after the train leaves. Laundry, bedding, candles, coal, letters, livery. The terms no woman sees until she is already stranded." Harlan's eyes flicked not to Nora, but to Hoke Drury and the teamsters. For the first time, Caleb saw him count the room and come up short. Harlan's face hardened. "Give that back." "No, tell them instead." Her voice did not rise, it sharpened. "Tell them what a woman owes you when you send for one bride and another arrives. Tell them what May Collins owed. Tell them what Ruthie Sloan owed. Tell them what I owe for refusing your kitchen." Cora stepped forward first. "You are out of place, Miss Bell." "Then name the place you make for women like me." The teamsters shifted. Eli Boone came down from the porch frame. Marta closed her eyes once, opened them, and moved to stand beside Nora. Harlan finally looked at Nora directly. "You want it plain," he said. "Fine. A stranded bride under my roof works until her seat is paid back, her meals are paid back, and the trouble she brought to my station is paid back. If she don't like that, she shouldn't come west under the wrong name." No one breathed. Nora held the board in both hands. "Say it again." He sneered. Every stranded bride who lands under my roof pays me back with labor. That's the plain of it. May Collins spoke from the edge of the yard. 6 months, he told me. Ruthie Sloane stepped beside her. 9 for me. Marta's voice broke, but it came out loud enough. And he kept the return tickets in the cellar so they could not leave. Now the yard moved. Not wildly, not like a mob in a story meant to flatter itself. Men looked at one another. The younger teamster took his hand off the pine chain as if it had burned him. Luis Ortega walked to Nora's side without being asked. Cora opened her mouth, perhaps to lie, perhaps to command, but the shape of the yard had already changed against her. Harlan saw it too, his face flushed dark. They're lying. Then why were our trunks hidden? May shot back. Why was my ticket cut? Nora asked. Tom Pike took one step forward, but Caleb was there before the man could raise the whip. Don't, Caleb said. Harlan did the one thing Caleb had hoped for and still despised him for. He lunged past the wagon wheel, snatching for Nora's hand. You ungrateful little fraud. Caleb caught his arm and slammed it down against the wagon's side hard enough to rattle the chalk board from Nora's hands. The board hit the dirt, but the truth no longer needed it. Nora had already reached into her apron pocket and drawn out the small fair envelope Caleb had once meant for surrender. This is mine, she said, loud and clear. My money, my wages, the means to leave. I stayed because I chose to stand here, not because you owned 1 hour of me. The oldest teamster, a broad man named Hoke Drury, spat into the dust. Unload the pine, he said to his partner. Harlan twisted against Caleb's grip. You don't haul that load, you don't haul for my hotel again. Hoke didn't even look at him. Then I sleep easier on the road. And after today, no Vale trunk, barrel, or board bill rides on my wagon. That was the true break. The other men moved at once. Wheels chalked, chains dropped, pine beams slid from wagon to shoulder. Luis and Eli carried the first brace toward the porch posts. Ruthie Sloane crossed the yard straight to Cora's wagon and lifted down a trunk with her own name painted half-scrubbed under soot. Cora cried out, "Put that down." No, Ruthie said, and the words sounded older than fear. May took another trunk. Marta went for the third. The storekeeper's wife, who had come only to watch, stepped forward at last and helped Ruthie steady the heavier box. Tom Pike tried one last time to push through, and this time Eli Boone put a hand flat on his chest and shoved him back toward the road. You heard enough truth for one morning, Eli said. Harlan's last defense came in the only coin he had left. Mercer, he shouted, if you stand with her, no buyer in Bitter Creek takes your herd note in June, no drayman hauls your freight, no store gives you a line of credit. Caleb let go of his arm slowly. Then I stand poor, he said, but I stand clean. It was not the sort of line he would have spoken a year earlier. Fire had burned shame out of him along with half his house. Nora looked at him then, and whatever fear remained in her face changed shape. It became something warmer and much more dangerous to his balance. Harlan backed toward the road because there was nowhere else to go and because every person he had counted on now looked at him as if the yard had finally named what he was. Cora followed, pale with fury, clutching nothing but her own gloves. Tom Pike spat in the dirt and limped after them. No one asked Harlan what he meant anymore. They had heard enough. No sheriff arrived, no clerk read a paper, no one needed to. The yard had chosen. By noon, the first wall beam was in place. By 1 o'clock, the women had their trunks loaded onto the empty freight dray that once served Harlan's hotel. Hoke Drury himself promised to take May and Ruthie to the next spur, with no board debt attached to the road. Marta stayed only long enough to hand Nora the ring of cellar keys she had hidden in her apron. For anything still trapped below, she said. Nora accepted the keys and said, after a pause that made Marta work for it. "You can come up the ridge if you want honest work. But if you lie once more to spare yourself, you don't stay." Tears filled Marta's eyes, but she only nodded. "Fair enough." When the yard quieted at last, Caleb found Nora sitting on the front sill of the house frame with dust on her hem, and the fair envelope still in her hand. "You kept it through all that," he said. "I wanted to remember the difference between leaving and being sent." He sat one step below her, not touching. "I nearly sent you myself." "Yes. I was wrong." "Yes again." He could not help it then. He laughed once under his breath, tired and raw. "You have a gift for making a man feel corrected, without letting him off easy." "A useful gift." They sat in silence while the crew lifted the door itself into place nearby. The blue enamel plate Nora had washed that first night stood on a sawhorse table inside the room, waiting for the kitchen that would soon exist around it. "Why did you stay?" he asked quietly. She looked out over the meadow, where the horses moved under the late sun. "At first because I was angry." Her fingers turned the fair envelope once. "Then because May and Ruthie deserved better than one more woman riding away alone while they were told their debt was law. Then because this place began to feel less like a refuge and more like a question I wanted answered." "What question?" She looked at him. "Whether a man who made room for my choice would still want me when I used it." He had no practiced answer for that, thank God. "I do," he said, "more than I know what to do with." The color that rose in her face this time was not from anger and not from cold. The afternoon turned to evening under the sound of hammers and men calling measurements across the yard. By the time the last of the crew rode out, the porch rail stood true and the front door hung in its frame. It was plain pine, not yet painted, with the new latch catching clean. Caleb sent the others on ahead and stayed where the doorway opened into the dim main room. One table, 2 chairs, a crate for a shelf, the blue plate on the table, ash gone, floor swept, air still carrying the faint resin scent of fresh-cut pine over the old memory of smoke. Nora came from the bunkhouse with her mended shawl over her arms and stopped in front of him. "Marta says the women are already halfway to the next spur," she said. "Good." "Hoke says Harlan tried to promise cheaper rooms if he'd turn back." "And?" "He told Harlan he preferred mules to cowards." Caleb smiled. "That sounds like Hoke." Silence settled around them, but this one felt different from the others. Not empty, waiting. Nora opened her hand. The fair envelope lay there, wrinkled but untouched. "This stays mine," she said. "It should. And if I keep it, no one gets to tell me I chose because I had no road." "No one does." She took one step, then another, until she stood beneath the newly hung door. The evening light cut around her shoulders in a pale gold outline. Beyond her, the ridge dropped into the meadow and the whole darkening valley of Bitter Creek. Before her, the room waited. The trunk that had been shoved back at her in the hotel now stood inside the new doorway, not as freight, not as debt, but as hers. Caleb felt his pulse in his ruined cheek, in his throat, in the hand he kept loose at his side because he had promised himself he would never reach for her without invitation. "Nora," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "If you step through that door, I don't mean to call you hired help. I don't mean to call you debt paid either. I mean to ask, when the work settles and the road is honestly yours, whether you'll let me court you the proper way." She looked at him a long moment, reading the parts of him he could no longer hide, and the parts he had finally stopped trying to. "You waited too long to say the plain thing," she told him. "I know." "Good, then you can spend the rest of the summer proving you learn quickly." He almost laughed again. "Is that permission?" She lifted the fair envelope once, as if weighing every mile she could still travel, then tucked it safely into her pocket and stepped through the rebuilt doorway. "It's a beginning," she said. He moved aside to let her pass, the same way he had in the bunkhouse room the first night, but this time she stopped just inside and turned back toward him. The blue plate sat on the table. The last light touched the fresh pine wall. Outside, the wind moved through the meadow as if nothing in the world had changed, though nearly everything had. Nora reached out and caught his scarred hand for the first time in full daylight. "Caleb," she said, "if you mean to court me proper, start by coming inside your own house." So he did. Subscribe for more clean, romantic Wild West stories, where brave women and lonely ranchers find home by choice.